So we had already talked about this in a previous video, but I want to reiterate and go back to the Bible passage of Psalms 139 and verse 16 because it really paints out the idea of natality. It describes the idea of natality and why following your archetype is important. So in Psalms 139:16, it talks about the substance, like your inward parts, that is referencing your soul. So I personally believe that we as people, that we are called to then follow our archetypes. We are called to then look within ourselves and understand how we're socially constructed, and then whatever role or whatever path that allows us to take, and understanding how God ultimately moves through us, through our archetypes. In verse 16, it says, all your days are ordained before they came to be, which really describes how you are to understand how you're socially constructed, and then you live your life according to that model. So, like I said, so archetypes, they shape character, and character describes the story of how people ultimately live their lives. When you follow your archetype, you are able to then navigate life as the creator has, set out for you, that he has ordained for you. Now we're going to talk about archetypal constellation. What is an archetypal constellation? So I like to think of an archetypal constellation as the link between two different archetypes. So for example, the first archetype that all humans come into contact with is the mother-child archetype. Everybody was a child, everybody was a mother. So the constellation would be the link between that joins and connects those two archetypes together. So you would say that the mother-child archetype, they are constellated. All archetypes are constellated and through each other because we are all interconnected, that we are all a part of God, we are all elements of God, who is the interconnected whole. And and that we're all composed of yin and yang elements. Also, for gender nuanced people more specifically, we understand that archetypes can be constellated within, for example, the archetype of the star-crossed lover, right? So how you'll have gender nuanced men or same gender loving men who are attracted to galletas, a gender nuanced man being the most yang and then galletas being the most yin, that those archetypes that are then formulated are, constellated. Another interesting thing about archetypes that I've mentioned before, but I'm going to mention it here again, is that historical time periods often have a archetypal construction to them as well. So we may actually pass through historical time periods that re-emerge. For example, now we're living in, these really tough times now. And so we're going through another recession. Recessions can be archetypal, or the Great Depression could be archetypal. The archetype of the Renaissance, we've discussed how that reemerges within our context, especially as Black people, through the weirdo signs. So this influx of, variegated Black people who happen to fall outside the realm of cultural intelligibility. And then along with these historical archetypes that reemerge, the archetypes of the people that lived through those historical time periods oftentimes reemerges as well. So for example, during the Renaissance, you had the flapper. During the weirdo signs, we have the baddie. So that's ultimately how archetypes work. Another thing is that archetypes can be culturally specific. So, for example, with amongst Black people, we have the archetype of the baby daddy, the archetype of the baby mama, the thug, the slave, the oppressor, the revolutionary, the gangbanger, the rapper, um, the old head, the square. All these are archetypes that are specific to our community here, or to the collective and things like that. And also for gender nuanced people, we have archetypes like the archetype of the fairy, um, the archetype of the fish, that kind of reemerged within our experience, that came from also the Harlem Renaissance as well. So One thing that we learn about archetypes is that the most important thing is understanding your story, is your narrative identity. And consciousness is about balance. And you know that you have a degree of balance because it's about the way that you tell your story. It's how you understand your character within your life's story. And so we embody our archetypes, like Epictetus said, that you embody your philosophy, we embody our archetypes, and they lead to a process of individuation. However, long exposures to complex trauma or things like that could ultimately lead to a degree of negative individuation. And that is usually caused by, maybe sometimes the person is not aware of something within themselves, within their archetypes. And so it can lead to a degree of negative individuation. It's really important to then begin to recognize our archetypes and how they emerge through us because sometimes there could be connected to degrees of trauma, especially for a people like Black people, where we have cultural trauma that still lives on within us, that from the trauma that our ancestors experienced and how those things were passed down. And so I want to read this quote by Reza Manakin, who says, "Many times trauma in a person decontextualized over time can look like personality. Trauma in family decontextualized over time can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people over time can look like culture. And it takes time to slow it down so you can begin to discern what it is." It's essentially that there are certain archetypes that may emerge within a person, a family, or a group of people that we are then saying is culture, but they connected to experiences of trauma that might have happened within a completely different historical time period. And so it's important to then become aware of that, become to know yourself, right? To understand yourself, so we can then begin to do the work to get the healing that we need from these cycles of generational trauma. The power of the archetype comes down to how one narrates their story, their life story. That is a person's natality. And we all experience some form of trauma. So trauma is, something that we all go through, we all experience. However, people who had like long exposure to like complex trauma or have unaddressed trauma, that it impacts how they then understand themselves in their story, in their life story. And through the process of archetypal analysis, we can examine our lives from an archetypal perspective that then allows us to then not only examine the archetypes that are at work, but also tell a story through the archetype that empowers us as people. So, for example, in the story of Ishmael, Ishmael grew up the neglected child, right? But the angel came back to him and said, "Well, Ishmael, you too can become a great nation." And so there, Ishmael had the choice. He had the choice to either remain a neglected child or he could tell his story in a different way, in a way that ultimately would empower him as a man. Consciousness expands like air in a balloon, and as we come to terms with ourselves, and we come to know ourselves deeper, then we then have this expanded sense of self. We have this deeper understanding of ourselves and our purpose here within this sacred field of life.